Good morning, everyone. I'm Bob Mann, Director of the Reilly Center for Media and Public Affairs at the Manship School of Mass Communication here at LSU. We're delighted to have you join us this morning for what will be an exciting, informative, and I think very revealing discussion about the history of civil rights, the coverage of civil rights in the media, and also, I hope, there will be a very good discussion throughout the day about where we stand now, the future of human rights, human relations, civil rights in this country, the way the media covers it, and also ways that our society is adapting and growing. Last night we had a fantastic kickoff to this forum, hearing from Dorothy Cotton, who is on the first panel today. She inspired us, and we learned a lot from her, and we're looking forward to hearing more from her and from all the other great panelists who've been assembled here, journalists, civil rights leaders, scholars who studied various aspects of civil rights. We're just delighted and honored that all of them and all of you have joined us this morning. Before I turn the microphone over to Bob Ritter to make the formal introductions, I want to first of all acknowledge our Dean, Jerry Seppos, and his support for the Manship, for the Reilly Center and for this program. I also want to acknowledge Bob Ritter and Ralph Izzard, who took the initiative to assemble this incredible collection of superstars in the civil rights field to be here today with us. And I also want to acknowledge two people who truly worked very, very, very hard, gave this program their all, and that's two people who work with me in the Reilly Center, Tara Brown and Emily Wascom, who did incredible work, and I want to acknowledge their contributions and thank them for everything they did to make this event possible. So without any further introduction, I'll turn this over to our Director of Student Media, Bob Ritter.
Thanks, Bob. Good morning, everyone. With so many accomplished writers as our guest today, I should also mention that Bob Mann has written a number of wonderful books, including a terrific biography of Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, a compelling history, I think, of the passage of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, and most recently a book entitled Daisy Petals and Mushroom Clouds, LBJ, Barry Goldwater, and the Ad That Changed American Politics. And I just wanted to mention that. All three of Bob's, he's a meticulous researcher and a wonderful writer. And I want to thank Bob and the Reilly Center for all they've done to help us with this event. Without them, we couldn't have done it. So thank you, Bob, and your staff. Very much appreciated. Dorothy Cotton, Moses Newsom, Gene Roberts, John Siegenthaler, a wonderful cast to kick off our conversation this morning. All played critical roles, either organizing or covering the civil rights movement. They've written themselves, I think, into American history through their accomplishments, their commitment to democracy, to equal rights and press freedom, and even more significant, I think, is that their work continues today. Everyone is still working diligently on behalf in various endeavors. Our moderator is no less luminary. Hank Klibanoff is an accomplished reporter, editor, professor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. In fact, it was his book, co-authored with Gene Roberts, that inspired this event. The Race Beat, the Press, the Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation was awarded the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for History. And the Race Beat recounts the role of the press, print, television, radio, African-American newspapers, establishment newspapers, both northern and southern, as they covered the civil rights movement really from 1944 through Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. As the New York Times said in its review, and I quote, "Until now, no one has authored an in-depth analysis of how and why the news media came to play such an important role in the struggle for racial justice." Hank is the son of a South, a native of Florence, Alabama, but his education and his career have provided him with a perspective on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. After receiving his undergraduate degree from Washington University in St. Louis and his master's from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, Hank served 6 years as a State House bureau chief in Jackson, Mississippi. And after taking a short sabbatical, which I'd like to do that now, especially what Hank did, backpacking in Europe and the Middle East, sounds pretty good. And a couple of years as a Boston Globe reporter, he joined the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1982. He would serve as the Inquirer's national correspondent for the Midwest and in a variety of key editing positions before being named deputy managing editor of that newspaper. You'll notice as our day progresses that three of our panelists, Gene Roberts, Hank, and Arlene Morgan, who you'll hear from this afternoon, are products of the Inquirer, a newspaper that won 17 Pulitzer Prizes in a 15-year span from 1975 to 1990, an astounding record of accomplishment in American journalism. Hank left the Inquirer in 2002 when he became managing editor for news of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a position he held until 2008 when he assumed his current role as the James M. Cox, Jr. Professor of Journalism at Emory University. I must tell you all that without Hank's counsel, and we would not have the stellar group of speakers that we're going to hear from today. And throughout this process of putting this symposium together, I kept my fingers crossed, really, that Hank wouldn't tire of my telephone calls and emails and constant questions. He never wavered, and we're all indebted to him for his wise counsel. This morning's panel is entitled The Movement, and please welcome Hank and our panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm tempted to say good day and goodbye. Let's call it a day. It's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank Jerry Seppos, the dean, and Bob Ritter. I ran into them at the John Siegenthal Center in Nashville during a conference, and they were getting ready to meet with John to talk about this, and they asked me what I thought of it, and I love the idea. I think these are great opportunities, primarily for the people I see in the audience, our students, because we are going to explore some history. Now, I will acknowledge that when I was your age, I was not always impressed when people came before me wanting to talk to me about history. And I will promise not to wag my finger in your face as I do my own children who are all your age, 3 daughters. One just graduated college, one just about to enter, and one in college, so I've got you bracketed here, like I do them, to pay attention to history. But I can assure you that your life will be deeply, deeply enriched if you do listen and hear what we're going to talk about today. Not because of anything I have to offer, but because of the experiences that are before you. I sadly waited too long to dive into the history. And thank you to Gene Roberts for inviting me in to work on the book, The Race Beat. I got to explore history in a way as an adult that I wish I had done it as a young adult and as a student. Let me introduce our guests, and then I'm going to introduce our topic after giving additional thanks, in addition to Jerry and Bob, to Bob Mann and to Tara and Emily for shepherding us around and answering all of our emails and being very helpful. Let me start on our right with John Siegenthaler. Now, John has done it all. He began as a reporter and worked his way up to editor of the Nashville Tennessean. He is a Southerner by birth from Nashville. He became publisher of the Tennessean. He left the newspaper business for a period of time to work in the government under Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and was actively involved as a federal officer in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And he has the scars to show for it. He took a mighty blow on the streets of Montgomery during the freedom rides there, and can address that topic today. He came out of that experience with a great appreciation for, more than anything, the First Amendment, and he was very instrumental in starting the First Amendment Center that now bears his name in Nashville. And many of us know that the First Amendment Center has tentacles that reach far beyond Nashville, and I believe has produced programs here and at universities elsewhere. So it's an honor to have John here. Thank you. Dorothy Cotton, who was our keynote speaker last night, is a force of nature. And I saw her at Emory speak recently when her book came out and when Emory opened up the SCLC papers. And she comes out of Goldsboro, North Carolina. And I'm going to shock you by telling you that, believe it or not, two of our panelists today are from Goldsboro, North Carolina, okay, Dorothy and Gene Roberts. Dorothy was very instrumental in the civic community education program of the SCLC under Dr. Martin Luther King, a close ally of Dr. King's, who understood the importance of civic education in a way that is only now coming to be recognized as valuable to all of us again. As many of you know, Sandra Day O'Connor has this whole idea that we need to be pushing civic literacy, and Dorothy Cotton was doing it long before anybody for the SCLC. She has written this book, which is a wonderful book that I've had a chance to spend some time with, and it's just an honor to have you here with us today. So, Moses Newson has an extraordinary history, also a Southerner. He comes out of Fruitland Park, Florida, which is a suburb of Leesburg, and he came up as a journalist with the African American Press. He had studied at Lincoln University, right? Am I remembering that correctly? And was a reporter for the Tri-State Defender, a weekly newspaper in Memphis. And that, too, was quite an important force in the South. It was created in the early 50s at the perfect time to cover what became this burgeoning movement, so that rare among every journalist you will encounter in the world today, Moses Newson was at the Emmett Till trial. He was at the Montgomery bus boycott. He was at Little Rock. He was at Ole Miss. He was everywhere. I had a great experience yesterday. One of our guests who will be speaking on a panel later this afternoon, Danielle McGuire, who's written a phenomenal book, At the Dark End of the Street, about exploding the myth of that era, that the great fear that white women had was of black men, when in fact, Stanley, the greater reason for fear and the greater cause for fear was among black women of white men, and the prevalence of rape and assaults on black women by white men. That's what her book is about. And she was saying last night when I told her Moses Newson was here, she says, "Oh my goodness," she says, "I relied on all of his coverage for an incident that took place in 1959 in Tallahassee." That she explores deeply in her book, and maybe you'll go into that more today. But she said he gave the absolute best, most thorough coverage at the time. By then, I mentioned he started off the Tri-State Defender. He later moved to the Afro-American, Baltimore Afro-American. Then he went to work at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and is retired now, living in Baltimore, and it's always a privilege to be with you. So. And Gene Roberts, who I had the great honor to work for at the Philadelphia Inquirer for a number of years, learned an immense amount from, and I can tell you that I'm just one of many people who got involved, who stayed involved in newspapers for many years, who came out of that newsroom and are today have an enormous influence over news coverage in America. You know, Bob mentioned that Arlene and I both sort of came out of that newsroom. There were many people who came out of the newsroom who are running news organizations, NGOs, who are in the academy, you know, and we are all have been imbued by Gene's wisdom and his understanding of the value and importance of news in our society. Then I had the further privilege, of course, of working with him on the race beat. Gene came out of Goldsboro, as I mentioned. He was a reporter in the South. In Raleigh, and he had also worked in Norfolk. He was at the Detroit Free Press and later landed the New York Times job in Atlanta a covering the South. He had a remarkable career as a reporter. It's a great pleasure anytime I get to go back and explore his writing from the time. I'm just privileged that he's become a good friend. So, Gene, it's good to be with you here today. I want to introduce our topic this way. We're going to discuss the movement. We're going to discuss what it was. But I think that because I feel the burden of history requires that I remind everyone who has forgotten what that history was like and inform those who don't know what that history was like to bring you in touch with what that was about. I think it's real easy to hear the stories. Oh, remember that time there were water fountains for colored and water fountains for white. There was the upstairs balcony, high up there, for African Americans in the movie theater, and the whites sat downstairs. That suggests that racism, white supremacy was pretty subliminal. And if you think that's all it was, I just want to make sure you understand that there was a brutality and a terrorism associated with that period of time. That in the same way, and it does not exaggerate, and if anyone wants to contradict me, I don't mind that, but it would not be an exaggeration to say that the terrorism that we fear today, the terrorism that struck Boston, presumably that was terrorism, the terrorism that reigns across the world that we worry about existed in the South during many of those years for African Americans. And bombs, abductions, lynchings, castrations, all of this was just the way life was. And so I don't want anybody to think that it was simply water fountains. It was something far more brutal. Keep this in mind. In the South, it wasn't just a de facto situation where you discriminated against someone because everyone else did. The laws required you to discriminate.
Right.
You violated the law if you did not discriminate against blacks. And so it's important to keep that in mind. I also want to say, just sort of, remembering that time, I want to read something from one of the great journalists of that period of time, Hazel Brannon Smith, one of the few women who was an editor at the time in the South, and who was not, I want you to understand, an integrationist. She was a conservative by and large. She just believed that white police officers and sheriff's deputies shouldn't be allowed to go along the street and just indiscriminately beat up black people for no reason whatsoever. There was an incident that took place in her town where a black man walking down the street with groceries stepped off the curb against the light, and the police officer just beat him right there on the street. And she was outraged about that. She said, "You just can't do that. That's not what we are here on this planet for." And she wanted some dignity bestowed upon the African Americans of her community. She wasn't pushing for integration. She was from the South, she'd gone to the University of Alabama. Here's what she wrote, because I want you to understand what a difficult time it was. And if it reminds you, as it did a New York Times reporter, Harrison Salisbury, of Russia, he had covered Russia, and then he came to the South. If it reminds you of Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s, that would not be inappropriate. I want you to understand the historic parallels to understand how awful it was in the South. She wrote, and this was in the 50s, "Today in much of Mississippi, we live in an atmosphere of fear. It hangs like a dark cloud over us, dominating almost every facet of public and private life. No one speaks freely anymore for fear of being misunderstood. Editors, preachers, teachers, and other professional people are affected by it, as well as business and industry. Almost every man and woman is afraid to try to do anything to promote goodwill and harmony between the races, afraid he or she will be taken as a mixer or worse." So with that understanding of what the climate was in the South, I'm going to ask our panelists one by one, and then we won't ask all questions to all panelists, but this one I do want to ask each one, and I'm going to start with John, is to discuss, and we'll go right down the line, discuss your memory of what life was like in your early years as a child, long before you were a journalist, long before you got your first job. You can sort of take it up there, and where the lines were and how you were influenced in your thinking by family, by church, by your society. What led you to think the way you are, and what prejudices or did you have to overcome? And I say in the race beat, you will find, Gene and I had the great fortune of interviewing a lot of journalists who overcame the prejudice of their parents, overcame the prejudice of their families. Some of us grew up in families that were not innately prejudiced. We feel fortunate, you know. But so I thought if each of us talk about sort of what we came to understand and how, that would be a great way to start this.
Thank you, Hank. And you know, of city, Nashville, Tennessee, where I was raised, at the time Hank's talking about was as segregated by race as any city in South Africa at the height of apartheid, as was every other city in the South. And I think back on that time, and it is hard for me, and I think hard for all of us, to imagine a time when if in that city or any city in the South, if you were black, any place you needed to go or wanted to go, you could not go. You couldn't go to the hotel or to the hospital or to the restaurant or the movies or to the city park or to the water fountains in the courthouse or the restrooms in the courthouse. And you could not go because local ordinances, state statutes, federal Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, said you could not go under pain of punishment. And beyond that, there were the damnable signs that told you where you could go and where you could not go. And as a white child, what I'm going to say to you is not really believable. I was there. I was raised in it. It was the culture of my town. And I never saw it. I never saw the indecency, the indignity, the injustice of it. Hard to define when, over a period of growing up, the outrage began to make itself felt on my mind and heart. And when I say I never saw them, never saw it, you say, well, you know, that's impossible. You were there on the buses. You saw black people having to struggle through those crowded buses to the back. Surely you must have seen people like Rosa Parks. And of course I did. But when I say I never saw them, you won't understand until you read Ralph Ellison, The Invisible Man, who says it in just the same way. They never saw me. They looked through me. They looked beyond me. It was as if I was not there. I had no identity. And that's the way it was with me. I can remember more times than I can remember, I sat on first a trolley car, then a city bus, late in the afternoon, saw those women board those conveyances, pay their fare, crowded, late afternoon. They've spent the day working in some white woman's home, maybe my mother's. And through that crowd, they struggle to the back where the signs and the laws say they must go. And when I say in my own mind I never saw them, I really, and I've said this before and thought about it so many times, where was my head? Where was my heart? Where were my parents' heads and hearts? My teachers, not once on Sunday did I hear from the pulpit anything about the indecency, the indignity, and the injustice of that. And beyond that, as Hank says so eloquently, and as he and Gene make the point about in their book about the coverage by the media, there was the violence. There was the bloody violence everywhere. And I will just take you for a moment to that one afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama, on that bus terminal. The numbers of hundreds of people, I don't know, 300, 500, screaming white men, women, and children, bawling at the top of their voices, hatred, spewing, kill 'em, and meaning it, and trying. John Lewis almost died that day. Jim Zwerg well might have. People like animals. And so I've got two questions that I'll leave you with. And the first is, where were our heads and hearts? And the other question is, where did the courage come from those young people who faced that violence, faced it knowing what happened to Emmett Till? Gene Roberts and I went on a panel with Mamie Till Mobley, his mother, long ago, and she told us that she brought her son home, she opened the coffin, she invited the cameras in because she wanted the world to know what we didn't see. I don't know how we were lucky enough, or at what point I was lucky enough to escape that trap, to begin to escape that trap. Who knows whether we've ever escaped? But it was, as Hank says, a vicious, violent, venomous time. Let me just leave it at that.
Okay, that's a good start. Thank you. Ms. Cotton.
I hope I can get through this. I guess I still haven't sat as closely with people who can talk as honestly as you do about what it was like. But I remember, obviously, so vividly living through all of that. I was born in 1930, June 9th, 1930. You can do the math. I don't usually talk about my age, but
Only because I'm older, I know.
June 9th, 1930. But it was hard for me to even get through. I mean, the pain of just listening to it. And I realized that at some points, I think I must actually avoid really facing so frontally what we went through, what we lived through. I talk about it a lot, but I don't know, just hearing it come from, I used to just use blonde, blue-eyed guys, but whether you're blonde, blue, I don't understand that because we don't describe people based on hair, whatever. But I don't like words white and black and all that stuff either. I think we've got to do something to deal with how we categorize people. That's another story. But I lived through all of that, and it was just hard for me not to ruin my makeup when you were, just talking. But when people ask me, I think I may have mentioned this last night, how did you get involved? When did you start? I remember as a youngster, I think I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, in Goldsboro, North Carolina, on Greenleaf Street. I lived in a little They called them shotgun shacks. You could look through the front door straight out to the outhouse in the backyard. And I was born in a house like that. And in 917, those 3 little houses are torn down now. And, and people were treated, well, you hear some of the description here. But I understand that my mother died when I was 3 years old. My father was left with 4 toddlers, 1, 2, 3, and 4 years old. And my mother died, and I have picked up that it was because she really couldn't get to a hospital because there was some complication in terms of the law. The laws didn't readily welcome the pattern, the habits were not such that black women, African American women, could just go to the hospital when they needed to go. I sort of picked that up. My dad could never really talk about it, but I picked it up from his older sister at some point, that she would have lived if she could have gotten into a hospital. So it was, I'm just surprised at how emotional that made me just now, hearing you talk about it, even though I talk about it at some level all the time, because I get asked to do talks about it. But I shared last night how I felt inside of me a stirring that is hard to find language for. When I think I was no more than 10 or 11 years old, when a little white boy was riding down my dusty little street, Greenleaf Street in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and he was paraphrasing "Deep in the Heart of Texas." I'm sure you all remember. How many you remember that song, "Deep in the Heart of Texas"? But he was singing "Deep in the Heart of Niggertown," and but as young as I was, I remember till this day, his bicycle as he rode down the street. He had gotten through the white part of the street because that part was paved. But when it got to the section where folk that looked like us, there was no pavement. So he was kicking up the dust and singing "Deep in the Heart of Niggertown." And I remember that moment, a feeling that I really couldn't put words to. And when people said, "When did you get interested? When did you get?" I think it started right there. When did you feel committed to do something? But I remember feeling just the wrongness and the pain of experiencing that little white boy riding down my part of the street. And I think that it's interesting and it is helpful, and I too am just deeply grateful for this work, this coming together now to really bring it further into the open. I don't know how many people have heard how broadly people really know, as you describe it so well, know what we really lived through. But I think it was at that moment, watching and hearing that little boy sing that song as he wrote down, I knew that I was going to be something else. I was going to work on that. I couldn't put words around it, as I've shared with some of you. I knew that something was wrong with that. I remember the feeling I had, the pain of hearing that little boy sing that "Deep in the Heart of Niggertown." I think that's about maybe all I should say, but at this point. But it started right there. There was a churning inside of me. I didn't know that what I was going to do, but that feeling never left me, and it has not left me until today. And I can get very. It's still painful to really hear and face frontally what you described, but I lived through it. I realized that as an adult now working in the civil rights movement, I had to go get a hearing test not long ago because I realized that I wasn't hearing as well through my left ear, and I realized that I got beat up on the beach in St. Augustine, Florida, and it just occurred to me that I took some licks beside my head because I took some children to the beach, and I was the adult, and then children 10, 11, and 12. But now, obviously a full adult, but we had what we called our Freedom House there in St. Augustine, Florida. And my job that day, my assignment that day, was to try to integrate the beaches. And we got beat up. One little girl got her nose broken. I've recently located her, this little girl. She is now a retired school teacher. But I remember that when I took one carload to the beach, and the children had to go through a little path to get back to the water. And I went back to our Freedom House, we called it, to bring another load. When I got back to the beach, children were running back saying, Miss Cotton, there's some men back there saying they're going to beat us up if we go in that water. And sure enough, they did. And I remembered when I had that hearing test, oh, that's where I took all those licks beside my head during the Civil Rights Movement, because I took another load. And when they ran back to me saying, they said if we come back, but I've got a second load now, and I walked with great resolve back to that water, because there was something in me that was not fear. It was that, you know, by golly, they're not going to stop me. They don't own God's ocean. They're not going to stop me from going to the beach. But they did beat us up. And there was a white guy walking through the group of policemen standing around who did nothing to stop our getting beaten. And but this white guy, I later learned who he was. He had joined our staff. Our staff was the team of folk we were working with Dr. King on our field staff. He was saying, why don't you stop them from beating these people? Why don't you stop them from beating these children? And anyway, he became a really wonderful staff person. But I think maybe enough said at this point.
Well, I want to come back to that question of the fearlessness, the dignity.
Right.
But if I go off on that now, I'll get off topic. So let me. I want. That's a great story that will launch us. Before you speak, Moses, I just want to point out that we all sort of know the story of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old Chicago kid who goes to Mississippi, goes into a store with his cousins and some other buddies. There's a white woman who runs the store. Maybe he does whistle at her, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he, you know, his mother says he has a stutter and a whistle comes out sometimes. Whatever happened, it leads to this storekeeper's husband and brother-in-law 2 nights later abducting Emmett Till from his uncle's home where he was visiting from Chicago, taking him out, brutally beating him. They killed him 4 different ways. And then they tied a cotton gin fan around his neck, 70 pounds, threw him into the Tallahatchie River. He floats up 2 or 3 days, or sometime later. A trial is held within 2 weeks, 3 weeks. The men are both acquitted, not guilty. That was an iconic figure in 1955, as she said. For the people of North Florida, where Moses Newsom came out of, there was a 1934 case that was egregious. They were all egregious, but this was particularly the case of Claude Neal. In 1934, not only was he lynched, but the announcement went out on radio for hours and hours and hours that this lynching was going to take place. And they came in from South Alabama. They may have come from as far as, Mississippi. I'm not sure. They came in from northern Florida, and there was a huge celebration while Claude Neal was lynched. And this is the environment in which Moses Newsom is raised. He's from North Florida also. I don't know if that had an influence, but and if it doesn't, just say move on. But that's the atmosphere that I wanted to sort of present as you talk.
Thank you.
And listen closely. He speaks quietly, but he speaks with authority. So,
I came from a small town in Florida, Fruitland Park, Florida. And if you don't know where that is, that's close to Leesburg, Florida. And if you don't know where that is, that's about 42 miles northeast of Orlando, Florida. And everything, anything you can think about was racially segregated. Everything. There was nothing that wasn't racially segregated. I think John was talking about the line. There was no line, it was all around you. You couldn't go any place, you couldn't do anything without being affected. First time I saw John, I had been on a bus in Anniston, Alabama. They set on fire and tried to burn Freedom Riders up. And we were sort of stuck at the airport down there trying to find a way to get to New Orleans. And he came in and persuaded the guys to book a special flight to get us out of there. But back in my home area, I suppose I was influenced quite a bit by reading some of the papers from other areas, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Amsterdam News, Norfolk Journal and Guide, the Chicago Defender, and the Afro-American newspapers. We were a poor family. Neither of my parents went to high school, and my father was a laborer. And I suppose you've heard of people who went up on the season to work. They would go up and work in watermelons. They would work in picking apples or something in West Virginia, further up. And if it rained or something of that nature, no money came in. And we would sort of survive because there was some small stores that would let you have credit during those hard times. I don't ever tell anybody that we were poor, but I didn't know it. We were poor and I knew it. And everybody I knew knew that they were poor. You know about the schools, segregation and all that kind of thing. I suppose one of the things that really indicated to me how far down on the totem pole we were. One of the things we did when we were in school to make a little extra money is to work in the citrus groves. You could go out and make pretty good money working in the citrus grove. And in 1945, when I was 18, and that February, everybody had to sign up for the draft. And we had a lot of German prisoners around Leesburg who were working in the orange groves and that sort of thing. And I would see them out there from time to time. They were under armed guard and that sort of situation. So one day I was sitting in the Fane Theater on Main Street in Leesburg. I was sitting up in the balcony like the folks up here. That's where we had to sit if you wanted to see first-run movies down there. And they sort of held up the movie for a little while, and then they led in all these German prisoners who were sitting down front with the white folks, and they were on the front line in the front row up there. And I'm sitting up there in the bleachers, and couldn't sit down there. And it just occurred to me that these are people who, a few months ago, were part of a regime that was killing Americans who were in the war zone. And this is the sort of situation we have where they are more privileged than people who grew up here and worked here and that sort of thing. But you couldn't do anything about it. So, you know, you just get up and you walk out of the theater, and a couple of blocks this way, you were at Pine Street, a couple of blocks further, you could go in a little place and put some quarters in the jukebox and just sort of think about the situation while you were waiting to be drafted to go off and fight for the democracy that we always touted and we're not living up to. But they were serious times, and I suppose those sort of things led me into journalism, where I thought a poor guy might be of some help. And from that, I got to cover the Till case down in Mississippi, and segregation in places like Little Rock, where we got chased around by a pretty vicious mob. And of course, covered the Freedom Riders. I'd just like to mention one little simple story about voting. And I do this just because it took place over in New Orleans, which is home area for a lot of you here. Just before I was to go out on the Freedom Ride, and I didn't catch the first leg on May 4th when they left. I caught up with them down at A&T College in North Carolina. I had come down to New Orleans to cover a voting rights story that was being sponsored by the Civil Rights Commission. And they had this lady registrar who was explaining over and over and over why no black people were registered in her parish down there. And the excuse was that all the white people could pass this little test she would give them, something she would think of, ask simple questions that she said everybody should know. And that went on for a great deal of time. And the lawyers for the Civil Rights Commission started asking her some of the same questions that she said that black people couldn't answer. And here was this registrar sitting up there, and she couldn't answer a single question that they were asking her, not one. And of course, I wrote this story, and the headline in the Afro-American, big banner across the page, it said that Dixie voter official flunks own test. And that was the kind of thing that the black press was doing out there to try to bring about change and expose some of the things that everybody knew was happening, but nobody was doing too much about. Thank you.
You know, I want to just briefly add one thing to Moses' bio. He talked about the Freedom Ride, the bus burning in Anniston, Alabama. And if you go back and you look at the photographic history of civil rights, that's one of the great photos. You see a Greyhound bus, a Greyhound bus with smoke billowing out of it. And in most of the pictures, you'll see Moses Newson in the picture, sort of looking back. He's got his suit on. He was on the bus as a reporter with his camera. When it got stopped, the fire was set underneath it, a fire's billowing up in it, and the thugs who stopped it and who lit the fire tried to bar the doors so that no one could get out. Okay, this was not just a prank. It wasn't just create a fire and get a headline. It was a murderous act. And they were saved only by, it turns out, I think that there was some law enforcement on the bus undercover, or somebody came on there. I can't recall the exact situation, but they were rescued. The other thing I wanted, another momentous time in civil rights history that Moses was part of was in Little Rock, and this is also recorded in photography and the photo history. You'll see photographs of a man named L. Alex Wilson, who had been Moses's editor at the Tri-State Defender. And the four of Moses and L. Alex Wilson and a photographer named Davies and Jimmy Hicks from the Amsterdam New York newspaper are all walking towards Central High School when they are set upon by a mob of white men, carrying bricks, and they just run. But they catch up with L. Alex Wilson, and there's a series of 9 photographs, I think we got 3 of them in the race beat, of these men attacking L. Alex Wilson and beating him almost senseless. Moses visited with him in the hospital or wherever he was, I don't know, that night. How brutal was this? L. Alex Wilson was a terrific editor. He shortly after that became the editor of the Chicago Defender, the pinnacle of black journalism. And this beating took place in 1957. By 1961, he was dead at 51 years old. And this is a man who could have been a great editor on any newspaper in America. And so these were consequences of that. And Moses was there at these seminal moments. I just wanted to, I left that out of the biography.
As we hang that out there, I just might say a couple of words about
Please.
that. We didn't know that there were a couple of state police on the bus that we were traveling in. And we got hung up down there. This long line of cars was following us, and we thought we were leaving Anniston, but they had stuff in the tires and that kind of stuff. So by the time we got to the edge of the city, they caught up. Okay. And they were breaking out windows, calling us all kind of names as they usually did, you know, communists and N-word and all that kind of thing. One of these officers that you spoke about pulled his pistol and stood in the door to keep mob members from getting onto the bus. And I had been shooting pictures when I worked out of town. I usually shot my own pictures and that sort of thing. And the camera I was using when they finally broke through and threw the bomb into the bus in the seat behind me, I was always lucky. I just got some burns around the ears and something of that nature. But I stuck my camera under the seat where I had been sitting. And eventually when I got off the bus, I realized I didn't have my camera. So that camera is now on display over at the museum in Washington. So anybody that's visiting Washington sometime would like to see the camera. It's over there on view, on display over there.
And you can probably find on Google Images the photograph of Moses years later holding the camera for a piece that was in the Washington Post about him. So,
Yeah, so.
Thank you. Gene, take us back.
My maternal grandfather was a militant, outspoken segregationist. My parents were not. It wasn't in them to hate or disrespect anyone. At the same time, they were not integrationists. Segregation was a part accepted as a part of life, as intrinsic as death and taxes. Nobody in the era in which I was growing up, in the 30s and 40s, that I knew seriously challenged that. Two incidents that caused me to question the system. One happened when I was about 9 or 10, and I was expected at an early age to participate in the work in the tobacco harvest at my grandfather's farm. And one of my jobs was to bundle up leaves of tobacco and hand them to a woman who would tie them on the stick. And the woman in charge was a black woman. She was a natural leader, and she was respected by black children and black adults alike. And everyone at the tobacco barn called her Miss Ordelia. And I called her Miss Ordelia. And one of my great uncles one day heard this and grabbed me by the arm and pulled me around the side of the barn and basically said, we never called them Mr. or Miss. And if we do, they will think they are as good as we are and have the same rights that we have. So we don't do it. And I question that because my mother and father had taught me to respect my elders, and Miss Ordelia was certainly an elder. So there was a conflict here someplace. 2 or 3 years later, I was visiting cousins of mine. I was in about 12 and was just beginning Boy Scout. And one of my uncles was farm manager at Cherry Hospital outside of Goldsboro. And this was a black hospital for the mentally ill, but as part of the system, all the managers were white, and the menial jobs were done by blacks. There was a creek that ran through the hospital ground, and everyone went swimming in it in the summer, but even swimming was segregated. White kids went in the prime of the morning or in the heat of the afternoon, and black kids went at lunch and dinner time, supper time we called it, when white kids weren't in the creek. We were having lunch one day after swimming, and one of the black kids came running up saying that another black kid had gone down in the creek and didn't come up. And my cousins and kids next door were senior Boy Scouts with their life-saving merit badge. And we all ran to the creek to see what we could do. And I was assigned, once it was clear that the kid was down and had not come up, to run to the telephone and call for an ambulance. So I just called for an ambulance and hit whatever the emergency number was in zero, and you were connected with an operator. And then I ran back, and the kids, my cousins and their friends had brought the black kid up and were giving him artificial respiration. And after a while, seemed like a very long time, it was probably 15 or 20 minutes, the ambulance came. And the driver got out and looked at the scene and said, "This is a white ambulance. You didn't tell me that this was not a white person." And he got back in the ambulance and drove away. Mm-hmm. I found that very traumatic, to put it mildly. But, and I began to question the kind of system that would allow this. That was an extreme example, but in most communities in the South, people knew stories of black people who did not get treatment in so-called white hospitals. But many people did not have. Some of my best friends grew up without working on farms, never had contact with blacks, and never saw a reason to question the system.
You know, I want to take it forward a little bit, because what's I hope clear about this is that the likelihood that segregation could ever end was a fantasy to think that it could end. And even progressive thinkers, mm-hmm. your progressive editors, you know, Ralph McGill and Jonathan Daniels and Mark Etheridge of that time, never thought it could end. As late as the 1940s, they're saying it will not end. It would be as if I said, starting tomorrow, daytime is going to become night, and you'll go to school during the night, and nighttime will be day, and all activities will stay the same, but it wouldn't happen. You would think it's impossible to happen. So my next set of questions is sort of, when did you know that it might change? When did you see the possibilities? Either through some human kindness that revealed itself And I'm going to start with Gene because I know I want you, if you would, tell the story of the Rock Creek Baptist Church. Or when did you, either from your own personal life or something you saw, made you think, this can change. There is hope. There is something that can really matter here that will make life better for everybody. And I'd like, any stories you can tell around that. I'm going to start with Gene, if you would, Gene. You want to tell that story?
This would have been in February of 1960. And my first brush as a journalist and in covering a civil rights story was with the Norfolk Virginian pilot. And the 6 white high schools and junior high schools were closed in Norfolk to prevent, I think, 14 or 17 black kids from going to white schools. And the argument in the white South was between people who said, no, not one black should attend school, or people who felt it was nutty and self-destructive to close schools to prevent a handful of blacks from going to school. And the argument was whether you say no to anyone or permit a few to come into schools. No one was thinking in at least in white debate about broader integration or sweeping desegregation. I was covering state government in Raleigh when the sit-in started in Greensboro and quickly spread to Durham and Raleigh. And Martin Luther King decided to fly into Durham to give support to the butt-in movement at lunch counters. Durham was not normally part of our territory in Raleigh, but I asked to go over to cover it, particularly to see Martin Luther King. And to the extent I thought about what I would be seeing, I visualized large numbers of black students because the sit-ins were a student movement. And visualize something like a pep rally. When I arrived at the White Rock Baptist Church in Durham, there were indeed lots of black students, but they were all milling around outside the church. Middle-aged and older blacks had come to the church 1, 2, 3 hours early to hear Martin Luther King and had taken up all the seats. The church was so packed that I wasn't even able to get close to the door, much less in the church. Finally, I saw a deacon of the church, or heard he was a deacon, and asked him, and told him I was there to cover the story and I needed to get in. And he said he would boost, it was an unseasonably warm night in February, and he said he would boost me on my shoulders and I could sit in the windowsill of an open window. So I did all the way through this, and I had kind of a eagle's eye view of everything that was going on in the church. Martin Luther King gave, as always, an inspiring, articulate move-in speech that had people on the edge of their seats. It was clear that you could tell from the windowsill that while there were obviously some college professors and school teachers in the audience, that most of the people in the audience were black maids and cooks. And at that time, money was so hard to come by in black communities, particularly among maids and cooks, that they tied their loose change in a handkerchief and knotted it a couple of times to make sure they didn't lose a nickel or a dime. And after Martin Luther King's speech, which dealt mainly with brotherhood and turn the other cheek and don't hate, but insist on your rights. And then Ralph Abernathy came forward, and his job was to ask for money. And from my windowsill perch, all over the church, I could see black pocketbooks coming up into women's laps, and hands go in the pocketbook and come out with a handkerchief. And everybody was unwrapping their coins and putting them in the collection plate. I left the church that night thinking for the first time that there was going to be massive change, not just token change, because I had seen clear evidence, which I hadn't seen before. I wasn't looking in the right places, of just how strong the support was for change in black America from the old down to the students.
Very telling, very telling. Ms. Cotton, can you talk to us about when you sort of felt that this might actually happen?
Well, getting involved, and when I got involved in the civil rights movement, sort of full time, it was becoming very active in the Yearfield Baptist Church in Petersburg, Virginia. I had moved from Goldsboro because I got a chance to go to college, thanks to my English teacher in high school. And now in Petersburg, Virginia, there's this young preacher that I met, Reverend Y.T. Walker, and I remember sort of exploring that church, and walked up one day, and there was this tall, handsome, good-looking preacher in Bermuda shorts, and he really caught the attention of people, and I stopped and talked with him too. And I remember that, and at that time, a much older woman, much older than I at the time, walked up to him, and I was standing there also getting to meet the new preacher. She said, "Son, are you our new preacher here at Gilfield?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am." He's also holding a golf club bag. Is that what you call you who play golf? And she said, "Well, son, you ain't lived long enough to have sinned long enough, to have repented long enough to be telling us what to do." And, but when I heard that preacher preach, and I knew I was hooked and determined to be active in that church. This Reverend Y.T. Walker became the head of the regional NAACP, and he asked me one day, because I was very active in the Young Women's Parish Club at the church, he asked me if I would do some nonviolence workshops. And I said, well, I got to go read something and see what this nonviolence is about. Of course, at that time, we had paid attention to what was went on in Montgomery, Alabama. And so I got involved right there in the church. I hope I'm answering your question. I can tend to get off
that's great.
topic here.
You're doing great.
But I remember some youngsters at the church who came to the Sunday school, and Wyatt, Reverend Walker, said, well, work with the children, help them understand. So I did a tiny little bit of research, but didn't really quite know how to get deeply into it, as I did, of course, years later. And I remember there's a photograph somewhere of me blowing smoke on one child, because we were going to picket the the downtown stores, especially the Woolworth store. And many, many, many moons ago, I smoked a little bit. Can't stand smoke, the thought of smoking. But I remember blowing, that was my nonviolence workshop. It's really just ludicrous because I didn't know much about it. But I knew that you weren't supposed to hit somebody back. And, but that's when I really moved into full action, working with Reverend Walker. Fast forward to a time when we now were really taking on institutions in Petersburg, Virginia, where I had got to go for college. And as I said earlier, I think we could not use the public library, people that, you know, of my skin hue. And Reverend Walker really took that on. And I became secretary to the Petersburg Improvement Association. You know, there was the Montgomery Improvement Association. There were a lot of cities had, this acronym for the city and then Improvement Association. And that really became the network for SCLC in a lot of cities across the South. And everybody wanted this little preacher, Martin Luther King, to come and, you know, do something. So Martin knew he needed a staff. That's how I got to be full-time staff. But back to really getting involved there in Petersburg, we started picketing the library and the store, and we wrote a letter. I found a letter, I think it's in my book, a letter that we wrote, one signed by me as secretary to the Petersburg Improvement Association, protesting the fact that we could not use the public library. African-American folk could go in the library in a lower level. It looked like a place where they brought in boxes of stuff, books, I guess. And we could go there. It was like about midweek on a Wednesday, I think it was, but we couldn't just go. And then they tell us you can't read and you're ignorant and we can't go to the library. It doesn't compute, does it? Did you get that point? You can't go to the library, but you... But we were protesting that, and I was working full-time with Reverend Walker. He really wanted to take that discrimination at the library to take that on. But we also then started to take on other places, and at the same time, we decided we were going to not only write letters to the city council about that situation. We got a letter back, incidentally, saying, we are sorry, but this property, talking about the public library, was deeded to white young men and women. And yeah, I think that letter's in, but I did find a copy of that letter when I was doing this book and talking about my getting involved. And
But
maybe
let me
that's
ask you this.
enough on that.
You probably wouldn't have done that if you didn't think it could succeed,
Okay.
right? So what made you think, or what did you know about the people of Petersburg, even the white people, that there might be some hope
Yeah,
that
I hear
could
you.
succeed?
I will say one thing about that, and that is, once something opens up in you, once you are involved, you keep going. You get more deeply involved. That really is the answer. Now fast forward from the little boy riding the bicycle, singing Deep in the Heart of Niggertown, and then something continually opening up inside of me, knowing that this is what started to happen when I heard that little boy singing Deep in the Heart of Niggertown. But knowing that something is wrong with this picture, that I can't drink out of the same water fountain, can't go to the public library, can shop all over the Woolworth store, but can't sit at the lunch counter. And I like to say, who wants to eat that crappy old food anyway, that lunch counter you all probably don't, some of you don't even know that the Woolworth stores were gone by the time you were up and running. But something evolves, and one feels as though, hey, I'm on to something good here. And we didn't put a timeline, an end point on the protest, but we were involved and I knew, speak for myself, but I know that everybody else, massive numbers of people came to feel the same way. We were on a roll and we were not going to stop. Something happens inside, just the very fact that we were protesting. As I said, I found this letter I wrote as secretary to the city council, trying to get the library open to everybody. And I was working with these youngsters who were helping to walk with picket signs in front of the store. And I remember an elderly African-American man walked up to me and said, "Lady, ain't you got a table at home?" And I remember putting down my picket sign, and I'm walking with the children. And I said, "Sir, if your wife were down here shopping, don't you think that she should be able to use the restroom or get something to eat if she needed to rest a while?" And I wish I could find that man and know whether my speech made any difference with him or not. But when he complained to me, this African-American guy complained to me that we were out there, you ought to get these nappy-headed kids out of the street. That was, can you imagine? You all remember when we were called, of course we had to take the ugly out of that, like being called black, but at one point we took the ugly out of it, and anyway. I hope that
No, that's
brings
good.
some
No, that's good.
response. But it's something I don't. Some people maybe who may be more poetic or something.
No, that's
you might put a different language, or a philosopher would. What really something was emerging inside of us. We were doing something good. You felt it, even though one couldn't put language on it at that time. But I knew what the situation in which we lived, the environment, the habit patterns, something was wrong with that. And so I know I was on a roll, as were many other people.
Okay.
Just kept going.
Thank you.
It's a feeling.
John?
You know, I remember shortly, maybe 6 months before Brown, our editor, Coleman Harwell, I was reminded of this not long ago because I got a memorandum, old memorandum, from Wallace Westfelt, who worked with us. And the memo is from Westfelt to Coleman Harwell, the editor. Harwell had asked him to put together a team to be ready for desegregation when it came.
It's 1954.
Yeah, in 1954. And this would have been in late 53 or early 54. But at any rate, so the team was made up of Dick Harwood, who later became manager of the Washington Post, Westfelt, who later became Huntley Brinkley's producer, and me, and David Halberstam. And the five of us would meet periodically and talk about it. And I remember they were all from out of town. And they all were talking about the change that was coming. I had covered police. I had covered the courthouse. I had been a general assignment. I knew the Chamber of Commerce. I didn't think change could come.
And you were the only one who was born in
I
Red
was the
Nashville.
one.
Right.
I was the local. I was the local yokel, and I simply, and I would say, yeah, but, well, I know that, yes, but. There came a time during the sit-ins when we were meeting, and David Halberstam got a call during the meeting from Carl Fleming. And Carl, this was the sit-ins, and
Carl Fleming was with Newsweek.
That's right. And Carl wanted to come to Nashville to meet with the young woman who was leading the sit-ins at Fisk, Diane Nash.
Diane Nash.
And, right.
Yeah.
And David interrupted the meeting, took the call, and Carl said, when can I meet with her? And David came back in and told us the story. Mm-hmm. And he said, she told him she could meet with him if he came in and she'd meet with him at 6 o'clock in the morning. And Carl said, 6 in the morning? And they talked about it and thought about it. And then David said to us, repeating what Carl said, and obviously it made an impression on me because I think it affected me too. Mm. Carl said, they're going to win, aren't they? Carl Fleming says, if they want me at 6 in the morning instead of 6 at night, they're going to win, aren't they? And I remember so well, and I had been in those meetings, and I had been negative, you'll never break this. You'll never break this crowd down, never break this city's back. And to hear Fleming say that was suddenly to remember those kids on the street, and those kids at those lunch counters, and those kids in jail, and those kids in court. I mean, the song said it, nobody gonna turn them around. Right. And Fleming got it before I did, but I got it.
And did you see white establishment figures start to change? And
it was slow. It was very, very slow. But once the sit-ins turned into a Easter boycott of downtown businesses, you began to feel the knees weaken of the business power structure. And they began to look for some settlement, some way out, because suddenly they realized the black purchasing power, all withdrawn during,
Right.
nobody buying bonnets or Easter shoes.
Right.
And that dollar figure helped move an awful lot of them toward, let's resolve this very early. I mean, the department stores were looking for a resolution, and it came. There was in the height of that economic withdrawal, there was a bombing of the home of a distinguished black lawyer, Z. Alexander Luby. Blew the house off the foundation, and the mayor that day, that very day, in a confrontation with Diane during a demonstration, said, no, it's not morally right to sell you anything in these stores but not sell you a hamburger. It's not morally right. And I remember David's byline was on the story the next day. Headline quoted the mayor, and the walls began to crumble. Right. But it was slow. You know, if you knew the city and you knew the South, you had doubts. It was tough. But when you saw them and talked to them and listened to them, and then heard Fleming say they're going to win, aren't they? Yeah. Begin to get the sense.
That's recorded with Diane talking to the mayor.
Yes.
Mr. Mayor, do you think it's right that we can't sit
That's
here?
what she put.
It is on film. You can see that.
And that's on. They reenacted that later, and somewhere it's on a video.
Yeah,
and
it is.
And she says to him, Mr. Mayor, is it morally right? And
Yeah,
he
right.
says,
No.
I thought about it. She asked an honest question. I gave her an honest answer.
right, he said.
And the business community looking for a way, absolutely genuflected in front of the mayor's acknowledgement that it's not morally right.
It's a good story. Good. In a little while, we will take questions from the audience. Want to let you know that. Moses, can you tell us when you sort of thought for the first time this might actually change?
Well, Hank, I tell you, a lot of times when I think good, and a lot of times I still have questions. You know, we had a public accommodations bill passed by the Congress long ago, and the Supreme Court came along and invalidated it. If you look at the overall picture, there has been enormous progress. If you just look at the media itself, the first day I got down to Tallahatchie County in Mississippi to cover the Emmett Till trial, the sheriff met us at the door and said, I have a press table here, but it's not for you black people. You don't sit at the press table. We're not going to have any integration in here at all. First day I got to Little Rock, the day after the National Guard had been called out. I'm out in front of Central High School to take pictures, and Colonel Marion Johnson, who was in charge of the troops, he came out and told me, you can't work up here because I think it would be more trouble as a result of your being here. And he actually had some troops lead me out of the area. That sort of thing is gone now, basically speaking. But when the first black newspaper came into existence, it was because the media itself was just like the rest of the society. You couldn't work there. You didn't get any decent coverage there. Eventually they get around to having somebody write the colored news here and there. In my state of Florida, the Jacksonville Times Union at one point had a separate office set up in the black community where they had about 6 black staffers, so they wouldn't have to work in the same office with the rest of the people. So we have made an awful lot of progress, and there's no question about that. But I'm not sure if I see any end in sight to racial segregation. It is, and the press coverage that goes along with it. I don't want to take a long time on this, but I'd like to mention a story that has sort of concerned me, the coverage of. That's the arrest of a Harvard professor, Gates, by a police sergeant, Crowley. He was charged with disorderly conduct, some dispute they had. For decades, the Supreme Court, the Massachusetts courts, all courts have made rulings concerning what constitutes disorderly conduct when a policeman is involved with a citizen. And to wrap it up in a nutshell is this: a United States citizen can yell at a policeman, they can call a policeman a name, you can request the policeman to clearly identify himself. And if nothing happens during this dust-up that causes some third person to commit some inappropriate act, there is no disorderly conduct. There is no charge for disorderly conduct. Now, the media, a large bit of the media, never ran that information in connection with the news stories that they ran. I'm talking about the Washington Post. I'm talking about the New York Times. They didn't run that information. It was available because it was on the internet in a lot of places. A lot of internet people were citing these decisions that I mentioned a moment ago. There were all kinds of lawyers at large institutions saying that this was one of the worst arrests ever. There wasn't any prosecutor in this country who was going to take that court to case. But in the media, and I'm talking big media people, on one occasion, the New York Times had 2 stories on the front page, in the right-hand side, side by side, above the fold. And they never mentioned these rulings that actually govern those kind of situations.
Yeah.
And so, to a certain extent, the kind of situation we had many, many decades ago where the press was involved with its role in the community at large, what in the black press we would often call the establishment, that it was part of the establishment. Sometimes I think I see some of that creeping back into the situation, and I don't think it's very helpful at all.
There may be many people who think, well, day is done on that. We've done that.
It's not quite done. I still can't figure any reason why that information was not carried along with the stories, and they just wrote reams and reams of stuff on that.
There was another story similar to that that didn't get as much attention, but the head of the African American Studies Department and quite a celebrated academic, Gerald Early, an essayist, he's at Washington University in St. Louis, happened to be at a suburban mall in St. Louis, and his wife is inside a store, and he doesn't want to go, as I don't with my wife, inside certain stores. And so he's just hanging around outside in front of a jewelry store, and the jewelry store calls the police, and they arrest him. And it was humiliating, it was embarrassing, and he was, they thought he was loitering and was, likely to come in and do some damage. And here's the most dignified, erudite, academic, one of those I've had the privilege of knowing, and it it's more likely to happen in that situation than if I had been hanging outside that.
Yeah.
Not that I'm erudite, so.
And could I ask,
Please.
could I just make a point?
Yes.
Briefly, because I think it emphasizes the temper of the times. You tell the story eloquently about the murder of Emmett Till. And on its face, it's outrageous. He's brutalized, shot, he's beaten. His mother exposes the body to the... What we often forget is that those two killers, acquitted by a white jury before a white judge, relying on no double jeopardy, then accept money from a reporter to confess to their stories, and that story is then told by them. Now, it was fuzzed up a little bit, but the outrage is complete when you know
Right.
how callous and cruel the attitudes were.
That's right. One of the first examples, for those of you who study journalism ethics, one of the first examples of checkbook journalism, in which Look magazine
Right,
paid
exactly.
a few $1,000s to the killers of Emmett Till to tell
Exactly
the true
right.
story of how they did it after they'd been acquitted, knowing they couldn't be retried.
Yeah, you know, in that case, this sheriff that I was saying, who would greet us at the door to tell us there was no seat for us at the press table, he didn't dig up any witnesses in this case.
Right.
I went out with a group, Medgar Evers, and a couple of NHC people looking for witnesses, and we came up with this kid who testified, Weed, and another guy. The sheriff actually testified on behalf of the guys who were acquitted of murder. So, and that was not unusual in some of those places.
Yeah, just to put a fine point on it, again, for some of the students who may not know these stories, in the Emmett Till trial, not only did the sheriff not really do his job in trying to investigate it, trying to find witnesses, as Moses is saying, forcing some of the journalists to go out to try to find the witnesses, because not necessarily to help the prosecution, though certainly you hope it would, but to find the stories, to tell the stories.
Yeah.
You have, a shocking situation when the most prominent African-American leader in Mississippi in 1963, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Medgar Evers, and at the trial of the man accused of killing him, Byron D. LeBeckwith, who walks in to the courtroom to shake hands with I shouldn't call him Mr. Beckwith, with Byron D. LeBeckwith, accused of murdering Medgar Evers, the governor of the state of Mississippi. Ross Barnett walks into the courtroom and shakes hands with the man accused of killing Medgar Evers. So when we talked before about how bad it was, it's to give you a sense of how institutionalized the sense of white supremacy was from top to bottom. I would like to I have other questions, but I would like to open up this to anybody who has a question that they might want to ask the panelists, or if the panelists want to say something more that they didn't get to close out. I do want to come back to the question that John I asked that I just love, is sort of where did the courage come from? But I'm going to hold off for a minute on that, and let's see do we have anybody who wants to ask a question? Here we go. We're going to have a microphone so that can pick you up there.
I was wondering, and I think Dorothy could answer this. What effect do you think that post-World War II had with black soldiers coming back and not getting the same benefit of white soldiers in terms of housing and veterans benefits and everything? Do you think that had an impact on their willing to get up and fight and give them the courage?
Well, you're interested in what happened when they got back. Well, there's some, I don't have a name at this moment, some veterans from the war have been quoted as saying, I'm sent overseas to fight for the right of somebody somewhere, and I come back home and I can't go in a restaurant to sit down to eat. So there was the experience of the veterans of the war, from the war, out of the war, their experience moved them to a new way of thinking about I call it American style apartheid in this country, especially relative to how they were treated after fighting for, you can put any adjective or noun in there you want to, after going overseas to fight and come back home and can't be treated as a citizen of the country. So that there are some military guys who are quoted as actually saying that and making that observation. So they came back with a changed consciousness about what was going on at home.
I might just add to that. Before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, of course, there were quite a few people doing that. She wasn't the first one by a long shot. And there had been court rulings before she refused to give up her seat. But there were black veterans who came back and refused to give up their seat on buses and whatnot. And a lot of them were jailed, beat up pretty badly. One guy lost his eyes in one of those cases when he was arrested. But it was a pretty tough time, but I went to school on a GI Bill, and there were a lot of benefits that accrued. But actually, black newspapers fought for the right for black GIs to serve and to have eliminated some of the discrimination that was taking place in the services themselves. Actually, we probably got into, I say we, the black newspapers, got into some sort of problem with the federal government because it wanted the black papers to stop campaigning for civil rights and fair play during the war period. And that became quite a tough sort of situation. There was some talk of bringing a sedition suit or something like that against the black papers, but I think it got worked out. Pittsburgh Courier started what he called a double V program for victory overseas and victory back here in the States, and that sort of smoothed that situation out to a certain extent. But that was quite a long battle. Black troops the problem was never wanting to serve. Well, some people didn't want to serve, period, because.
Could I just add a word?
Reason.
Please.
Excuse me, Moses, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sure.
Moses said earlier, talked about the draft in 1945, and as it affected him, it also affected me. I just decided I didn't want to be drafted, and so I joined the Air Force. And this is before President Truman desegregates the military.
Right.
And I was a control tower operator in MacDill Field, Florida. By this time, the ignorance and blindness I talked about in my childhood, was beginning to lift. And I can remember 6 a.m. to noon shift, sitting on top of that control tower, looking down on a field, bugle blows, reveille. On one side of that field, white troops falling out. Other side, black troops falling out. Fall in, call the roll. One group goes marching off to a black-white mess hall for breakfast, the other to a white. And right there in front of me is the American flag.
Yes.
I mean, we had all raised our hands, sworn to uphold the same Constitution, fight for the same flag. And you really can't go through that without saying, what's wrong with this picture, But it just shows how ingrained it was, not just in the local cops, but in the federal government and in the military.
Yes.
And you understand then, I think, the outrage of those troops who came home after fighting for that flag.
Sure. Yeah. Amazing. What a great image. That's great.
Just a couple of, there's a picture in my book here, if your back's not bent, of my dad in his Navy uniform. And some of you may have heard me share yesterday. My dad said, I will never go back to Atlanta, Georgia again. And I'm a teenager when I'm hearing that, because they put my dad in the Navy, even though he's got 4 toddlers to raise by himself. And I think, now why didn't I ask him to discuss it? But I didn't know enough to ask him, because I'm hearing this as a teenager, that he went to Atlanta with 3 of his Navy buddies, white guys, and all 4 of them were in Navy uniforms. I was thumbing here because there's a picture of my dad in his Navy uniform. The 3 white sailors could go, he was in the, I said Navy, 3 white guys could go in the restaurant, and my dad couldn't go. And that sometimes brings me to tears, because my dad didn't live to see the fantastic change that has happened in the country. And enough said, but that is just well documented, even in his Navy uniform. And I wish I could say, Dad, you can go back to Atlanta now. One of my best friends, Andrew Young, is the mayor of the city.
All right, we have a question here. Tara?
Yes, I just want to thank the panelists. This has really been fantastic. And to just pick up on the comment about the impact that the veterans coming back had, there's a great book out. I think it's a wonderful book. It's called Swallowed Tears by Freya Anderson Rivers, who grew up in Baton Rouge, and her father was Dr. Dupuy Anderson. He was a dentist. And she talks about in her book how when he came back and saw the injustice here and having to serve the country, then that was some of the impetus of the civil rights movement here in Baton Rouge. But going back to the question of when did you know that things were going to change, that was fascinating to me, because I grew up in Baton Rouge, in segregated Baton Rouge, but I'm about 20 years younger than the folks on the panel. And we never had a doubt that things would not change. Yeah, even though they were at their worst, I mean, and there were even strategies. Now, I'm 3rd generation college. My grandmother actually went to college, and so my folks were educated. They got master's degrees outside of the state of Louisiana because they couldn't go to LSU. But I think a lot of it had to do with we knew that it wasn't right. And I think in church we were always taught, we knew that God had delivered the Israelites. And so we knew that we were going to be delivered. And there were strategies. You talked about the white people were told not to call black people by their last name. I knew when I was about 4 years old why when my mother would call servicemen to come in, anybody over the phone, if they asked her name, she always said, "My name is Mrs. Robert Yancey." And she never told them her name was Delcy Yancey. And I asked her, "Why'd you do that?" She said, "Well, if I tell them my first name, they're going to call me my first name. But if I say I'm Mrs. Robert Yancey, they have to call me Mrs. Yancey." And so there were all these strategies. But I do have a question in all this. And I guess my other quote, I think Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And so we always knew that. So there was never a doubt, even those of us who integrated the schools and had the horrible treatment that you've heard, we knew that things were going to change. But it seems to me that we have, and I don't want to be an awfulizer, as Dorothy Cotton talks, but it seems to me that we are worse now than we were even, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. I think that the absence of the black press, I mean, when I was growing up in Baton Rouge, I got so much news from the black press. And that's largely non-existent now. So much of the perspective that was available before integration is gone. Even when you look at the school situation, I grew up in segregated school system. I'm a chemistry professor here at LSU. I couldn't even walk on the campus of LSU when I was in elementary school. But everybody in our high school in the chemistry class was black. So there was a class of 30 black students in chemistry. Whereas now there is a complaint about, you really don't see black students taking science because there are very few African American students in those technical courses. So it seems, and I just want to get the panelists' view of this, it seems that although I know integration had to come, it was necessary, but I don't think we predicted the negative impact. We didn't see that they were going to close all the black schools. So the New Farmers of America, that was a wonderful organization for black youth, was going to get absorbed into future Farmers of America. And those young people were not going to have the same opportunities that they had when they had their own institution. So I just want to get your ideas about whether or not you think that even though there's been a lot of progress, a lot of the dedication, the fire, the community that existed and the resources that were available are just not here anymore. And I don't want to be an awfulizer.
Yeah. I have 3 or 4 words to respond to that, and I want to quote a friend of mine, actually a fantastic musician he is from Nigeria, but he's been in this country, really smart guy. I think I picked this up from him. He said, you know, and he's very, very black-skinned, handsome guy. He said, you know what? Black folk ghettoize themselves in this country. I would put that out just to think about whether we ourselves contribute to having to or living in a ghetto. But he said this to me just a couple of weeks ago, and I decided to give some thought to what he was saying. So if you got a black this and a black that and a black this, are we not ghettoizing ourselves rather than having a different end view? His name is Aloja, so think about that as a quote, a comment from Aloja, but he's making me think in a new way about complaining about the black schools or the black whatever being closed. Think about it. I'm thinking about it.
No, I think, yes, we haven't, Moses, did you want to say something on that before we go to the next question?
Well, let him go.
Okay.
Mr. Newsom, I spent some time in Tallahatchie County. I used to live in Clarksville, Mississippi. And I want to do paraphrase, then I want to ask you a question. I know in your discussion, in the classes I teach on campus, the civil rights movement and the black church, et cetera, and so on. I guess my question is, how can we make this stay alive for young people? Because sometimes they think it's archaic, happened so far back. Let me give you a quick story. Mr. Kimball, you talked about being in a department store. My son wanted to play soccer in Clarksville, Mississippi. I was one of the pastors of one of the largest African-American churches in Clarksville. My wife was a dean of a community college. My son wanted to play soccer. He was denied application to play soccer in Clarksville, Mississippi. This was about 15 years ago. My son cried himself to sleep. To make a long story short, I was called to a meeting in Clarksville, Mississippi. Like the movie, all the city fathers called my wife and I in a meeting. I couldn't believe it because I had been insulated. I'm a pastor. My wife is a dean. This can't happen to me. So you asked the question. You made a statement about it's not over yet. Could you expand on that? Because I can relate to that. It's not over yet.
Well, I guess I can probably do 2 things at once here. The question about whether we're better off or not. I know there are a lot of things that were going on in the black community at one time, which you no longer have to the certain degree that you had them before. But there's no question that we're better off. You're in a position now to reach for the sky to a certain extent. On the other side, here's the situation we have. This is a democracy. People think different ways. But I'm of the opinion that you cannot teach democracy in schools forever without young people at some point looking around and saying the world is changing, I'm changing, we have to change. It's a tough road to hoe, but just several years ago, people said blacks won't vote, young people won't vote, Hispanics won't vote. You look at the figures now, and that's no longer true. It's going to get better, and young people understand that America is America, but there's a big world out there, and it's all changing. And the challenges are out there. They're going to be a part of that big world. And you will see these changes coming. There are going to be a lot of individual and some group setbacks, but you got to keep pushing.
I have another question before I ask mine. Yes, over here.
What do y'all think the role of the press has been in affecting change? Oh, what do you guys think the role of the press has been in affecting change?
And do you mean historically or more recently? How would you?
Historically.
Historically?
Yeah.
The role of the press in affecting change? Gene, would you? You wrote a book on it.
Well, the early and very underestimated press movement was in the black press. The first black newspaper appeared in America in 1827. And on its front page, it said, "Too long have others spoken for us. We need to speak for ourselves." And black newspapers, particularly we talked about what happened in World War II, but it happened even more so in World War I, that blacks fought, returned, had high expectations. A white riot swept the country to put black ambitions down. But out of all of this came a more aggressive black press in the wake of World War I. And arguably, segregation was at its worst in the 20s. And the black press became strong in the 20s and even stronger in the 30s. And they created a readership of people who were constantly told that we should have the same rights as anyone else, and we'll only get them if we fight for them. And this was sort of a constant refrain in the black press. And it laid the groundwork for everything, I think, that was to come after World War II and the 50s and 60s and the Civil Rights Movement. And if we had not had a black press and people like Moses Newsom, we may have ultimately gotten there, but it would have been an even slower process than it was. The white press basically ignored the racial story in America until the Emmett Till trial. If you had to sort of pinpoint a turning point, it would have been the Brown decision in 1954 and the Emmett Till case that followed a year later. But every little advancement was a struggle in the mainstream press. There was a debate, one of the earliest debates in the 30s, was whether the word Negro should be capitalized. And it took an inordinate amount of time for that to happen. The next issue was whether black women should be given courtesy titles and be called Miss or Mrs., and that took quite a while. Interestingly, when the Black Power movement started, and it got its real surge during the James Meredith March in June of 1966. But then you had the question of Stokely Carmichael and Black Power leaders wanted to be known as blacks. Martin Luther King wanted to be known as Negro. Interestingly, there was a huge debate about this on the New York Times. The New York Times has a style book for everything and has a rule for everything, and they want uniformity in usage. And we had a big discussion, and basically I was covering civil rights at the time. And I said, they asked me to make a choice between black and Negro. And I said, if Stokely Carmichael wants to be called black and Martin Luther King wants to be called Negro, who am I to make that decision? It took like 5 years before there was a kind of standard style book usage that black was acceptable for common usage. But it has been a low, strong, long time struggle, and incremental change, sometimes moving very slowly, other times moving very rapidly. But there has been change.
And one of those changes, going to your question earlier, of course, is, there was, and you know this from your own life, there was a black professional class that was self-employed at the time, or they either ran the schools, ran newspapers, undertakers, academics, professors, who integration did not ultimately allow to be preserved in that way. And so as the mainstream press, white press, begins doing the right thing over time and hiring more and more African-American reporters, of course, it undermines the black press's ability to really compete on stories, and that's the consequence of something that overall was a good public policy, but had ramifications that some people saw and anticipated and argued against, and some didn't see. We're closing out here, and I want to close out, I was so struck by the question John asked before, where did the courage come from? And I want to tell a story. And there's in the many years that Gene and I had the privilege of working on the race beat, and reading, miles and miles of microfilm and books, and doing interviews, and just total immersion in this. There was one line I came across that struck me as just a spectacular line of writing, and partly because of the situation that it described. And I'll tell you about it. It was, if you go back to 1955, 56, and as they know very well, and follow I just want to give you a little timeline here. Emmett Till happens, he's murdered in August of 1955. The trial is in September of 1955. Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat December 1st of 1955. This is all within a very collapsed time frame. The Montgomery bus boycott begins on that day, December 1st, 1955. It is 100% successful. It lasts for 381 days of people abandoning the buses that was primarily dependent on a black clientele, okay? Dr. King is there in Montgomery. There's not very much attention coming from the national press, coming to Montgomery and to the bus boycott. It exists in a vacuum, and yet very successful. It wasn't dependent on Time and Newsweek and the New York Times and coming in and writing about it. It was its own successful story. Meanwhile, in February of 1956, at the University of Alabama, after 1,200 and some odd days, an African-American woman named Autherine Lucy is ordered to be admitted into the University of Alabama. She's been trying since 1952. She's already gotten her undergraduate degree. She's 26 years old. She wants to get a master's degree or another degree in library science, okay? She finally gets a court order after all this time, aided immensely by Emory Jackson, who was the editor of the Birmingham World, the African-American newspaper in Birmingham. So she gets on campus 2 days. The national press comes there. It's not lost on Dr. King in Montgomery that he's not getting a whole lot of attention to this very quiet, successful boycott, but that by the dozens, the national press is coming in to Tuscaloosa. Why? Because there could be violence, because a woman might actually be killed, because there is a mob there, and there is a mob scene. It makes good coverage, makes good television, makes good whatever. So, in the crowd, so she gets through 2 days relatively peacefully. On the third day, the university has allowed this mob to form, and truly they are there, and they will kill her if they can, is the great fear. A New York reporter, a New York Post columnist named Murray Kempton, and that's a name that they're familiar with, some of you are familiar with, sometimes could write beautifully and sometimes could just be tortured in his sentence structure, okay? And he's watching this scene from a distance, and he sees authoring Lucy as she's driven onto campus, the back seat of a car on the floorboard through the mob. And she's going to get out of the car, and she does, and she walks within 10 feet of this mob. And she starts climbing these stairs, and Murray Kempton's watching this. She starts climbing these stairs of the building so she could go to her class. And he's watching her as she gets to the top of the stairs, and she looks out across this mob. And he sees a smile cross her face. And it's not a smile of derision. Certainly it wasn't humor. It may have been just an appreciation that if this is my moment, this is my moment. If I'm going to go now, I've gotten this far. Mm-hmm. And he writes this passage that I just thought was beautiful. He says, "What is this resource of this otherwise unhappy country that it breeds such dignity in its victims?" What is this resource of this otherwise unhappy country that it breeds such dignity in its victims? Now, she would not have considered herself a victim. I'm sure you didn't consider yourselves victims. That victim is a proxy for something else, because there were many victims. So that sort of goes to the same question. Where did the courage come from, the dignity? If you go back and you look at the photojournalism of the era, if you look at the Birmingham photographs of Charles Moore, of the African Americans standing up to the police officers and smiling even, you cannot comprehend the courage. Can I ask you, Ms. Cotton, to go first and talk to us about, in answer to that question, where does the courage come from?
I'm going to be incredibly brief, believe it or not. People had found something to which to give their lives, and that was important for folk like me and authoring Lucy, Charles, all of the people that you named and that you know about. That was exhilarating, that was exciting to have found something to which to give our lives. It just felt so right. And the feeling, even though we couldn't put, in some cases when we began, words on it, we knew that we were tackling something that needed the energy we were bringing to it. That gives you a feeling of success and excitement. And I'm doing something good. I'm doing something worthwhile. Thank you, God.
Yeah. Gene, can you just talk about the courage that you saw in people? I mean, there was too many opportunities for people just to stand back. In some cases of the journalists themselves, willing to take the heat.
Talking, which sort of relates to this, about change, the most important and crucial change that has occurred is the diminishment of fear among Black Americans. And we lack an appreciation that white supremacy rested upon fear, that blacks couldn't trust anything. White mobs could form instantly and into a lynch mob. And you couldn't take your problems to a court because everything was white. The judge was white, the law enforcement officers were white, even the court stenographer was white. Everything was white until you got to the electric chair. And that was yellow in most states and used for whites and blacks alike, but more so for blacks by a large percentage than whites. There's a lot of change that made the diminishment of fear possible. Probably the most important one was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and federal enforcement of it for the first time since the early days of Reconstruction, which made it possible for blacks to start voting out of office racist sheriffs and getting a voice in the criminal justice system. One of the most important but sort of unheralded events, because it happened incrementally, was the desegregation of juries in the South, which made it possible for blacks to sit in judgment of other blacks and not have that totally in the hands of whites. So the absence of fear was extremely
Yeah.
important development.
Moses, what can you tell us on that?
I think young people all over the country, particularly those who were involved in civil rights activities, particularly school desegregation. And you just saw it at so many places where they would march down through these angry crowds. And one that particularly comes to mind at Little Rock. Daisy Bates and her crew decided one day that the kids would not go up there. One of the young ladies, Elizabeth, didn't have the telephone. And somehow in all the rush, and nobody actually told her. So she went up there the next day, and she was by herself. She tried to get through National Guard, and they closed ranks. They wouldn't let her go through. And then she started trying to walk away. She said that she didn't know exactly what to do. I wasn't up there that morning because the kids weren't supposed to be up there. But as soon as I heard about it, I rushed over and started interviewing her. Her life was deeply affected by that, things that happened later. But during the time that I was talking to her, she said, I just didn't know people could be so cruel. And, but she said, when Mrs. Bates said, we can go back, I'm going. Here's a 15-year-old kid. And they had called her every name in the book, scared her to death. Some white woman, Mrs. Lorch, came to her rescue and helped her get on the bus to go back home. But young kids were showing that sort of spirit throughout. And I don't know, sometimes you don't supposed to do it, but just stop writing and listen to her talk. about what happened to her. Her knees were shaking. She didn't know she'd make it to the bus stop and that sort of thing. But she said, as soon as Mrs. Bates says that we can go back, I'm going. And it was a sort of bravery that these kids showed all the way through this desegregation thing.
You know, I think that's so powerful when you think of that question. I didn't know people could be so cruel, says Elizabeth Eckford, the African-American 15-year-old walking through the white mob, and the photographs captured it, and they've captured the white students trailing behind her, yelling invective at her. And yet, what the world asked that day was, and said to themselves, I didn't know a student could be so courageous.
Yeah.
It's the flip side of the same story, and in the long run, I think we can take away a good feeling that the courage is what we remember.
Yeah.
In some ways, more than the cruelty, though we don't ever want to lose sight of the cruelty. John, I'm going to ask you to comment on this whole idea of you asked the question.
Well,
Now,
I asked
you get to answer it.
I asked it for a couple of reasons, and if you'll bear with me a moment, I'll
Please.
Recount it. You know, just say to Jerry and to Jerry Sepos and to Bob Ritter and to everybody at LSU, the wonderful thing about this session is that you learn something. I learned something every time the events of 50 years ago are recounted. And not long ago, I was on a panel with Diane Nash in Washington. And I said to her, there came a night when the first wave of, and this is just to show how you find out things you didn't know. I said, there came a night, first wave of Freedom Riders wiped out. Next day, Anniston, Birmingham, some of them are hospitalized, smoke inhalation, they've been beaten. They vote, discontinue the rides. The Freedom Rides are dead. At that moment, the Freedom Rides are dead. And those sit-in students in Nashville, Diane Nash, John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, Jim Bevel, Marion Barry, they come together and say, we're not going to let violence overcome nonviolence. Their mentors are worried about their lives. And there is a great heated discussion. Will Campbell at one point challenges John Lewis and says, John, you know you shouldn't do this. Your Christian pride is taking hold. And John says, yes, Will. I admit the sin of pride, but we're going to go. Now, their mentors thought they had them. They give them the check to buy the tickets for the bus and the train. And the rules of Nashville SCLC were had to be 2 signatures on the check. And so I'm saying to Diane on this panel, tell me about that confrontation where you wouldn't go. And I've always heard they gave you a check with 1 signature. She said, that's right. She said, do you know who Sam Sims is? I said, I was raised in Nashville and I covered police. Yeah, he's a numbers racketeer. She said, Jim Bevel took the check to Sam Sims, who cashed the check with which the renewal of the Freedom Rides takes place. And
Never heard
so, you know, you just learn all the time. Right. You learn a new piece of evidence that adds to the richness of the story, right, and to the drama of the story. And I'll just repeat, the reason I continue to ask the question is because I remember I'm now gone with that first wave of Freedom Riders by air to New Orleans, delivered them to their friends. And the next morning, the Attorney General calls and says, there's another wave coming down from Nashville. Do you know Diane Nash? Who the hell is Diane Nash, he says. And so I end up that morning talking to her on the telephone. And I'm saying, young woman, don't come down here. I've seen people who almost got killed. You're going to get somebody killed. Do you not realize it? And it's a more elongated conversation than that. But the punchline is, there comes a moment, and I can remember to this day, her voice was as calm and as placid. My voice is going up decibel after decibel, and I'm screaming, don't you know you're going to get somebody killed? And she says, sir, we all signed our wills last night. We all signed our last wills last night. We know somebody's going to be killed, but we're not letting violence overcome nonviolence. To this day, I'm astounded by the courage. Still don't know. And I believe, they believe, somebody probably would die. And I'm still in awe of it. Their parents were telling them don't go. Their mentors that night were telling them don't go.
That's
And
my
they
favorite
went.
story from John.
Yes.
That's my favorite story from
Yeah,
John.
yeah.
I just want to say, working with young children in Birmingham, Alabama, young children, I can hear them now running down the street asking their friends, you going to jail today? You going to jail today? You going to jail today? It was the thing to do. And you can put your own interpretation on that, but they knew something important was happening, and they felt they wanted to be a part of it. I also saw a man chasing his teenage son down the street, and we assumed that he was angry with his son because his son had gotten involved. And I would like to know if the father ever caught him, but I don't know.
Wow. Gene wants to say something. We have one more from the audience after Gene.
We forget the courage of the black students who were first to desegregate the white schools. And Moses mentioned Elizabeth Eckford. But a year later, I was in Norfolk when the schools reopened after having been closed for almost 4 months, 3 to 4 months. And I was assigned on opening day to go to one of the 6 white high schools that were being desegregated. And this was the one in which they expected the least problems. It was in a sort of upscale neighborhood. And most of the other journalists were at 2 blue-collar high schools. At this particular high school, the principal was very concerned that there not be trouble. So he arranged for the black student to come after the opening bell of the school, and all the students were inside the school, so there could be no hassling of the young black girl who was 16. So after everyone went in to school, the car drove up carrying her, and she got out of the car. And there was a long walkway, almost the equivalent of a city block, from the street to the school. And she walked and got halfway and stopped and started shaking all over. Her hands were shaking, her whole body was shaking. It seemed to me to go on forever. It was probably just 20 or 30 seconds. But then suddenly she dug her elbows into her side and she stuck out her chin and she propelled herself into the school. At this point, I was so curious about what was going to happen to her once she got into school. I was considerably younger then, so I took off my coat and tie and took my Porter's notebook as if I was a student, and followed her into to the school. All the students in this particular school were mostly college-bound students, and they had seen their lives flash, the white kids, before their eyes, that they probably wouldn't get in the college they wanted to get in because they'd missed so much school. So everyone was so happy to be back, there wasn't any problem. But she had no way of knowing that, and it was just amazing that that students could find the courage to do this sort of thing.
Amazing. Yes, the audience. Yes.
Look at poor schools, when we look at the number of African Americans who are unemployed or underemployed, I'm wondering, because I hear my friends say we need another civil rights movement. For those of you who were so involved in the movement, either covering it or participating in it, what are your views regarding the state of Black America vis-a-vis coming out of the civil rights movement and where blacks are today?
I'm going to turn both to, I want them to, anyone who wants to answer the question. We're running out of time, so let's keep it tight. I do want to also point out that that seems to be also a topic that'll come up in the afternoon session as well, and that might be a deeper exploration of that very good question.
I'll wait. I'll wait.
Well, go ahead now and just hum a few bars if you will.
I summarized that one approach to answering your question by saying that no, and we can describe the it, isn't over, but I've come to the conclusion that it will never be over. And I don't mean it in terms of what we came through, but in terms of building the world we want to live in. We're on a journey. And if you're going from here to California, you go part way and you stop and sleep somewhere. Then you go another part of the journey, something else. The world, as the world changes, we too have to look at what are the needs now. How do we identify what's not working right now? And we have to put some energy into looking at, really describing what's not working now based on the goal that we have set, and based on the journey, the end goal. But maybe there's never any end. I was looking at, you probably watched the story of Jesus over the Easter weekend. Anybody watch that? Let me see it. Nobody but me? I see you. You don't have to be ashamed to hold your hand up. I watched it and I thought, way back then, talk about violence. I mean, you will be killed because you spoke against the city of Rome or something like that. And the killing then, because we were in a conversation about the violence, proliferation of violence. But I stopped with that. But I'm just saying, I think it will never be over. We have to define what it is that's not working right and work on that. And when you finish working on that, there'll be something else.
You know, let me say, and I think that was a great benediction, actually, for this whole topic. Thank you for that. Again, and this sort of goes back to my earlier remark about the importance of history, which, again, I feel like I came to too late, and I implore our students not to wait too late. If you go back and to see some of the speeches that were given in this country on the floor of the United States Senate in the 1920s, or, you know, the senator and governor of South Carolina, Ben Tillman, went on the Chautauqua circuit and to look, you know, through the North, giving speeches to thousands and thousands of people that portrayed African Americans in the most animalistic terms, okay? And that was just got covered in the newspapers as if, well, so-and-so, you know, and so the violence and the dehumanization of a segment of our population is not new. And there have been times, as Jean said, when it's been much worse, you know, in which the violence was much worse. Now, I hear what everyone's saying. That is no reason to say it's time to stop. because what we know is what we're capable of, both in a negative way and in a positive way. And unless we keep pushing the positive, the coming together, we are in danger of slipping back into the negative. You know, I've studied this issue for a long time. I learned so much today. I want you to know that you are all the beneficiaries of stories that I've never heard, and that, as John said, many of us have never heard. This has been a great opportunity to hear it. I want to thank the audience for sticking with us, for such good questions, but especially our panelists for their wonderful insights. And with that, Bob, I think I'm going to gavel this order to adjournment. This session will adjourn.
You are a wonderful moderator.
Great, Hank.
John Siegenthaler, Dorothy Cotton, Hank Klivanoff, Moses Newsom, and Gene Roberts. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for sharing so candidly, and thank you for enriching our hearts and our minds this morning. One more round of applause for our wonderful